Well, today we get to start talking about World War II. World War II was a cataclysmic event. It killed tens of millions of people. It was total war. It involved entire societies. The average civilian's life was actually not that strongly affected by World War I. You could be sitting there in Paris or London, and as long as you weren't at the front, you didn't know anybody who was at the front, which was unlikely, but your life really would not be affected very much at all. In World War II, that was not true. Entire populations got heavily involved. Within the United States, which itself wasn't attacked in any way after Pearl Harbor, nevertheless, everybody really felt their life impacted significantly by the war. It was much stronger in European countries. Civilians became targets for the first time in warfare. The war ended, in fact, with 2 uses of the atomic bomb against civilian populations. Now, even if you were not directly bombed, your life would be affected in pretty dramatic ways. Wilfrid Sellars, who we read right at the beginning of the course, was in graduate school at Oxford when the war broke out. He ended up working for the Naval Office throughout the war and never finished his PhD. He got hired anyway, such as it was in the late 40s. You could get hired without finishing your degree. But part of the reason for that was that so many people had their lives interrupted. They were no longer doing what they had been doing. They were part of the war effort. And so it was a dramatic transition by the end to go back to civilian life. People had to pick up their lives more or less where they had left off. But the disruption of the average person's life was immense. Now, we've talked about this setup throughout the 1930s, that low, dishonest decade, up through the fall of 1938, the Munich Agreement, what Churchill referred to as an unmitigated defeat. 1939 saw events accelerate. In March, around mid-month, the Germans occupied Prague. Hungary also invaded Czechoslovakia and took parts of the regions that it wanted. Slovakia declared its independence from what was now the Czech Republic. This was something that had a tremendous impact on Western opinion. Up to this point, you could argue that what Hitler was doing was either reversing the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and so taking back the Tsar, taking back Alsace-Lorraine, remilitarizing the Rhineland, doing things of this sort, basically setting things right and reclaiming what Germany had had before World War I. Or you could say, as for example, uniting Germany and Austria, well, really this was just following out President Wilson's vision of uniting ethnic groups and linguistic groups within national boundaries. So if there really was no significant ethnic difference between Austria and Germany, well, maybe it's not a big deal to have Germany annex Austria and so on. So all of that could really be defended as trying to either set things back to the way they had been before the Treaty of Versailles, or could be described as following out President Wilson's vision of self-determination. However, this couldn't be. When has Prague ever been part of Germany? The answer is never. Who lives in Prague? Czechs, right? Not Germans. What language do they speak? They speak Czech. They don't speak German. Okay? So there was no plausible claim to this. This hadn't been part of Germany in the past. It was not something that could be described as uniting the German people under one flag. No, this was outright aggression. So all the things that Western leaders like Chamberlain and Lloyd George and a variety of others had been telling themselves throughout, well, don't worry, Hitler is just realizing the terms of the treaty were unjust. And, you know, we know that, old boy. Of course, they were unfair. Yes, you can, well, let's just ignore them. Okay, that was the idea up to this point. And suddenly Chamberlain realized, wait, this is naked aggression. This can't be justified by anything that we've thought might be lying behind these German actions. So Chamberlain recognized a deep betrayal. Remember Hitler's words, this is the last territorial claim I will make in Europe. Well, within a few months, he utterly betrayed that. He said, no, I want the rest of Czechoslovakia too, not just the Sudetenland. So, Chamberlain came before Parliament and gave this speech. Today I share their disappointment, their indignation that those hopes have been so wantonly shattered. How can these events this week be reconciled with those assurances which I've read out to you? Is this the last attack upon a small state? Or is it to be followed by another? Is this in fact a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force? Now notice it's a rather large step from the Sudetenland, the last territorial claim uniting Germans under Germany, to trying to take over the world. But he realized, at least for the first time, wait a minute, Hitler is actually taking seriously those things he's been saying. Maybe that wasn't just for home consumption. Maybe he's serious that he actually wants to dominate the world by force. It didn't take long. 1 week later, Germany invaded Lithuania. Then, by the end of the month, Chamberlain said, I now have to inform the House that in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, in which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. They have given the Polish government an assurance to this effect. Now notice what he's saying. He is saying, listen, I'm drawing a line in the sand. Don't attack Poland. If you attack Poland, Britain will enter the war to defend Poland. Now why does he draw the line there? After all, keep in mind at the end of World War I, that whole Danzig corridor, a lot of eastern farmland, a huge chunk of Germany was taken and made part of Poland. So actually, if Hitler had gone into Poland first, what would Chamberlain have done? Probably would have said, well, he's just reclaiming the things that were taken away by the Treaty of Versailles, right? And so, in fact, that's all Hitler ends up doing when he does invade Poland. However, because he went to Prague first, Chamberlain's, well, to put it sort of boldly, the scales fell from his eyes and he saw what Hitler was ultimately up to. And so basically he said, no more of this. I've been thinking that you're trying to reclaim what was rightfully Germany's. Now I realize that's not the plan at all. So I'm drawing a line. I sense that the next place you're going to attack is Poland. That had been, or at least regions of it had been part of Germany. But I'm telling you, you can't have it. Don't do it. Now, he put the full faith of the British government behind this. It took a while. In April, Mussolini invaded Albania. He sensed that, look, if you're not going to defend Czechoslovakia, you're surely not going to defend Albania. And he was looking for something that the Italian army could actually conquer. So he picked on Albania. At this point, the USSR offered a mutual assistance pact with Britain and France. Okay, saying, listen, would you like to be an ally of ours? After all, maybe you're right about this Hitler guy. Well, Hitler had formed a non-aggression pact with Poland. He renounces it. So this is always a bad sign, too. Remember I said it's a bad sign if Hitler says he's not interested in you. That means you're in deep trouble. But if he's already said, I won't attack you, and then he says, you know what, I take that back. Now you're really in deep trouble, okay? You know things are heading toward a very bad place. Anyway, here is actually an amazing story. Between April 16th and May 4th, it looks like just simple bullet points here. But in fact, something quite dramatic was going on. Stalin was offering to help Churchill, well, at this point, not Churchill, Chamberlain, and the French government against Hitler. Stalin was offering an alliance with Britain and with France. Now, what did the British and French do? After all, he would have been putting Hitler in a very difficult position, right? Chamberlain has already announced, if you attack Poland, Britain will come to Poland's defense and fight against Germany. Russia was basically saying, look, we'll go back to that alliance we had in the First World War, the alliance that forced Germany to fight on two fronts, a Western front and an Eastern front. So what do you say? How about if we be allies against Hitler? If you were Prime Minister of Britain, what would you have said? Yes, right? What do you have to lose? This is an ally, and you see this heading in the direction that it seems to be heading. You'd say, of course. What if you were the President of France? What would you have said? Yes, again, what do you have to lose? However, what did they say? Actually, they said nothing. The diplomatic cables sat there in the bureaucracy. No one responded. No one answered. So for 3 weeks, the Russians had this offer out. We offer you an alliance against Hitler. We'll have a mutual defense pact. If he attacks you or if you get involved in this Polish war, we'll join you. They do nothing. In the French bureaucracy, they say, oh, what do we do? Right? They do nothing. Nobody does anything. Nobody makes any decision. In Britain, what do you think of this old fellow? Stalin offering me Ireland. Just like World War I. Ha ha. I don't know. Let's show that to the Prime Minister. Nobody does anything. Nobody responds. Nobody makes any decisions. The British and the French never discuss this. A nice interpretation is that it somehow falls into the depths of the bureaucracy and nobody really knows what's going on. But in any case, nobody responds. Well, Litvinov was the Russian foreign minister who had put this initiative together. When in 3 weeks the British have not responded, the French have not responded, Litvinov gets fired. Stalin says, "You fool! You offer an alliance? These people show contempt for us. They don't even respond. You're fired. You're out of here. Go to Gulag." Okay. And he replaces him with Molotov. Now, Molotov. What do you know about Molotov? Yeah, the Molotov cocktail, right? And it's not a shaken, not stirred thing. It's you put gasoline in a bottle with a rag on top, you light it, and then you throw it, okay? That's named after Molotov. Gives you some idea of his character. So he replaces Litvinov as foreign commissar. The Soviet offer is withdrawn. Basically, Molotov says, yeah, we are not going to cooperate with those people. So that opportunity for an alliance is lost. Well, on May 22nd, the Pact of Steel between Hitler and Mussolini, they agree that they will fight together. So any attack on Germany will be construed as an attack on Italy and vice versa. And then in August, in secret, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, where Stalin and Hitler form a formal alliance and agree to cover each other's backs. So what happens is we've got an offer of an alliance put out to France, put out to Britain. There's no response. The Russians are peeved. They say, well, then we'll go to this Hitler guy. After all, we've been learning a lot from him. We learned in the Night of the Long Knives, you don't actually have to play these psychological games with your opponents. You just shoot him. He's kind of a kindred spirit. And so they get together, and they make a pact. And there it is. We have photographs of this, even though it was secret at the time. They were quite proud of it. And so there you have Stalin laughing. Here you have Molotov. You have Ribbentrop. You have the top brass of Germany and Russia meeting and formalizing this alliance. Well, notice that happens August 22nd. 1 week later, basically, Germany decides to invade Poland. Now, they're covered. They're thinking, wait a minute. Remember Chamberlain said, oh yes, those faraway people in Prague, of whom we know nothing, right? Well, guess what's further than Prague from London? Poland. And so they think, look, the British aren't going to do anything. It's going to be another of those cases where they're in effect bluffing. They're not going to do anything about it. So Germany invades Poland. Right away, this was really, despite, in retrospect, all the indications, that pact, for example, was secret. And so people were not expecting this. The first cables from the front in Poland are Polish officers saying, we're under attack, we're under attack. And headquarters responding by saying, are you insane? Why aren't your messages in code? Answer is, there's no time to fool with codes. We're being shot at. And indeed, within a very short time, Poland was overrun. Now, it didn't take long. Chamberlain was a man of his word, even if Hitler wasn't. And so the very next day, France and Britain both declared war on Germany and promised to come to Poland's defense. But now what could they do? What country is in between France and Poland? Germany, right? So there was really no easy way for them to do anything to defend Poland, and indeed they didn't. Now, within 2 weeks, Soviet troops attacked Poland from the other direction. This was really part of the pact. The decision was made, yes, we'll form an alliance, but also we will divide Poland between us. Lots of rich farmland there. We'll take the western part. You guys take the eastern part. They split Poland in half. And so the Germans attacked first. 2 weeks later, the Russians attacked. And indeed, by the end of the month, they've split Poland up. There's a Soviet-German frontier and friendship treaty where they agree on the division. It doesn't take long at that point for the Soviets to say, well, that worked out well. So they invade the Baltic state. They take over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. They also, well, at least the part of Lithuania the Germans hadn't already seized, they take Finland. Now, there's only one good thing to come out of any of this part of the war, really. That is that the Poles managed to capture and smuggle out of the country an Enigma machine. What is the Enigma machine? Well, it's that. It looks like a typewriter. But it's in fact a very complicated code machine. The Poles managed to get it out of the country and get it to England. where Alan Turing and a variety of other top people studied it and were able to break the German code. For the rest of the war, the British were able to actually read German communications. Now, this created all sorts of interesting moral dilemmas. At one point, for example, Churchill got a message that the Germans were about to bomb Coventry. There was a lot of historical significance in Coventry. There were a lot of people there. In fact, his own son lived in Coventry. What do? Do you try to evacuate the city? Do you try to rescue or hide some of those things that are valuable in the city of real historical significance? If you do it, the Germans will know you've broken the code. So there's a real dilemma there. What would you do? Churchill let them bomb Coventry. Okay, he did nothing to defend Coventry, not even to get his own son out of there. And so he thought it was vital because he wanted to be able to continue reading the communications. Now, of course, you might think, well, wait, if you read the communications but you're never able to act on them because that will tell them you're reading their communications, what good is it? You know what's going to happen, but that might not help you. Well, in some cases, it might not help you. In other cases, it will. In any case, it turned out to be actually a crucial addition to the war effort. The German code, they were convinced it was unbreakable. They weren't actually that worried about losing one of the machines because they said, yeah, no one will ever figure it out. Well, actually, the German code was broken very quickly by Turing and the rest of the British team. Now, Churchill at this point recounts the lost advantages of the Allies. He basically says, look, Germany had been disarmed, justly or unjustly, by the Treaty of Versailles. Germany then rearmed itself in violation of treaty, but with the winking approval of British politicians like Baldwin and MacDonald. Air superiority and then air parity was cast away as the British allowed the Germans to build an air force, and then actually an air force even larger than Britain's. The Rhineland was forcibly occupied. They sent troops into that region of Germany near France that was supposed to be demilitarized. They allowed Germany to build the Siegfried Line of defenses along the French border. That was also in violation of treaty. No defensive fortifications were to be built by the Germans. The Berlin-Rome axis was established when, in fact, Mussolini was eager to become an ally of the French and the British. Austria was annexed, and they did nothing. Then Czechoslovakia, its army and its munitions factories were seized. The British and French not only did nothing to prevent that, but actually agreed to it at Munich. And then potential US and Russian help was squandered. Just like Italy, the Russians offered an alliance with Britain and France. In this case, they weren't turned down over the Ethiopian War. They were just ignored, and so they ended up in an alliance with Hitler, as Mussolini did. The same thing, by the way, was true of the United States, though not in nearly as dramatic a way. The United States had been offering various forms of assistance. Listen, you probably need money so that you can get it to a Polish group to help defend, etc., etc. All of this was ignored as well. So the US wasn't offering troops, and there was already an alliance, but nevertheless, various financial aid efforts or diplomatic efforts were really ignored. So Churchill says, history, which we are told is mainly the record of... Wait, Churchill accent. I have to think my way into this one. History, which we are told is mainly the record of the crimes, follies, and miseries of mankind, may be scoured and ransacked to find a parallel to this sudden and complete reverse of 5 or 6 years' policy of easygoing placatory appeasement, and its transformation, almost overnight, into a readiness to accept an obviously imminent war on far worse conditions and on the greatest scale. That was a terrible imitation of Churchill. I should edit that out. That was awful. I'm just not feeling it today. But anyway, here's the moral he draws. He says, look, still, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there's no hope of victory because it's better to perish than live as slaves. So he's pointing out that, look, we had an opportunity. From 1933 on, really, at any point, and almost every year, there was at least one opportunity to say, no, we will not allow Germany to do this, and to have Hitler removed. In fact, they were within a few hours of accomplishing that in September of 1938 without doing a thing, because the German generals were already primed to do it. And instead, they put themselves in a situation where they were now weaker than Germany. In fact, add Germany to Russia and to Italy, and they were significantly weaker. They really did not any longer have military superiority. In fact, they were quite inferior. Moreover, what were they going to do to defend Poland, to defend Lithuania, to defend any of these countries? There was really nothing the British could do. So it would have been easy to repel German troops from the Rhineland, for example. It would have been easy to move in and do something about the Sudetenland. But in this case, no, it's not easy for them to do anything, even if they want to. Now, I think Churchill is raising a disturbing thought here, and I've called it democracy's dilemma. Is this inevitable for democracies? It's well known that democracies are reluctant to fight wars. Democracies very rarely fight other democracies, for example. And so you could think, well, that's a good thing, right? Democracies don't like war. War's a bad thing. This is a positive thing for democracy. But he says, well, yes, except for the following thing. When there really is a tyrant, when there really is someone bent on aggression, it means that democracies put off the fight until the conditions are stacked heavily against them. And so his worry is, look at what happened during the 1930s. Foolishness, unwisdom, yes. Low dishonesty, yes. On the other hand, what is it about democracy that actually puts in positions of power leaders who are going to do that, who are going to appease, who are going to decline to fight, at times when it would be easy to fight, until finally the odds are stacked against them and fighting is inevitable? Is this something that is just to be chalked up to the foolishness of certain leaders like Neville Chamberlain, Stanley Baldwin, well, for that matter, David Lloyd George, the people like George Lansbury, who in the Labour Party, even when they were out of power, were exerting strong pressure against war and against even keeping up armaments? Is it just the foolishness of those people, or is this something that is a tendency of democracies themselves? What do you think? Is this a matter of those individual leaders being foolish? Or perhaps just too shaped by the experience of the First World War to respond any other way? Or is this really something that is inevitable for democracies? Churchill, by the way, doesn't give you an answer. He simply raises the question and then basically moves on and says, well, now I'll go back to events. But I think it is a puzzling question. Is there a tendency on the part of democracies to postpone wars until they become actually much worse, much bloodier, much more difficult? Okay, some people are saying yes. Do you have an argument?
Like, we haven't been in a war since World War II. So like, we've kind of been, like, we've been in, there's never been, like, official wars. Like,
well, okay, if we think about the United States, I mean, we've engaged in military action many times since the end of World War II. But notice we tend to describe it as something else, right?
It's like police action.
It's a police action, or it's part of an alliance, right? It's not just us. In Korea, it was really the United Nations. In Iraq, it was the coalition of the willing, something like 40 countries that George W. Bush cobbled together as allies to take part in the war. And so we've done things that did involve military action, partly consciously because people were worried about democracy's dilemma and worried about a tendency to not resist aggression. On the other hand, have felt the need to do that. Haven't simply said, in many occasions, aha, look, something's happened, we're going to intervene at a time, unilaterally and directly, in the way that Britain and France would have had to do at that time. On the other hand, the fact that there have been things like Korea, Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, where else? Beirut, then of course Iraq, Afghanistan, I'm forgetting Kosovo, Grenada. Anything else?
Syria,
oh yeah, Somalia, and yeah. I mean, you add that up and you think, well, gosh, it's not like we've been just sitting there saying, yes, we won't fight. Or, yeah, well, anyway, never mind. I can now try to do an imitation of Lyndon Baines Johnson, but I'll save that for later. My fellow Americans. What we'll have to do, really, is think about this as we go on. Churchill doesn't propose an answer, and in a certain sense, it's a very large historical question. Now, partly because of the experience of the 1930s, I think Western leaders, since the Second World War, have been tending to think, you know, he's right that there is this tendency. And so it's important that we not look the other way. But it remains a big issue that divides, for example, the political parties, that has divided coalitions of what would otherwise be natural allies across international boundaries. They have different attitudes about this. To what extent is there really this tendency? Has the United States gone too far in the direction of counteracting it? Or have we maybe not gone far enough? Have we tended to postpone fighting until it becomes difficult, as in Vietnam, rather than take care of things when it would have been easy? In any case, I think it remains a question for us today, and it remains a question really throughout every decade of this course that we'll study. But his concern is to say, look, if the circumstances are such as to warrant it, force may be used. And if this be so, it should be used under the conditions which are most favorable. There is no merit in putting off a war for a year. When it comes, it's a far worse war or one much harder to win. And indeed, Churchill was somebody who throughout the 1930s had been saying, we must not permit this. Remember, I told you about Goebbels' briefing where he says, look, it's unbelievable. If I had been the French foreign minister, I would have said, Hitler is the guy who wrote this in Mein Kampf, said this and that. Either he's gone or we march. And Churchill was the only person virtually in Britain who was saying, that's what we've got to say. Hitler has these designs, he's got these plans, we've got to do something. And yet, nobody did anything, so the war came at a time when Britain and France were very weak, and conditions were very difficult. Well, by the end of September, the Germans and the Russians had divided Poland between them. In October, the Nazis began the extermination of the sick and disabled. Up to this point, Hitler had jailed and in many cases murdered his political opponents. But his genocidal aims, his aim of getting rid of everyone who was not an ideal archetype of the Aryan race, that had not yet commenced. It began in 1939. And it started with the sick and with the disabled. November 30th, the USSR attacked Finland. Then this whole area of the war, this whole time is called the Twilight War, by Churchill simply because Britain and France hadn't yet started to do much of anything. They had declared war, but no actual action had started. By the beginning of 1940, rationing began in the UK. It was something that extended to the United States as soon as we entered the war. Sugar, flour, butter, meat, gasoline, all sorts of basic necessities of life were rationed. And indeed, there are ration coupons people had. And so it wasn't enough to pay the money at the store for bread or for flour or sugar or butter or whatever it was. You had to have the coupons to show that that was part of your fair share. In March, the Nazis bombed Scapa Flow, the largest British naval base in Scotland. April, they invaded Norway and Denmark. They took over, 2 days later, Denmark surrendered. Denmark wasn't very tough. Norway, that took them much longer, actually. That was a much tougher fight. May 10th, the Nazis invaded the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. And so they basically replicated what they had done in World War I, pushing the German columns through, not going through the defensive lines further to the south, but instead going through the Low Countries, through the Netherlands and Belgium, into France. Now, that was May 10th. And so you can see what's going on here. Russia has taken the adjoining countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland. Poland has been divided. Czechoslovakia is already basically German anyway, in addition to Austria. And now we get an assault through the Low Countries here and into France. The objective, Paris. Launched on May 10th, the very day that Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain. He gave a famous speech in which he said, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Okay, and it's also where he writes in the books, I knew the government was now in my hands and that I could actually put into action what I wanted. He said, I slept well that night. I didn't dream. Facts are better than dreams. And indeed, that becomes his theme. He's the only one who, in his view, has actually been paying attention to the facts. So there's a photograph. Okay. May 10th, the attack starts. 5 days later, the Netherlands surrenders. 18 days after the initial attack, Belgium surrenders. And then, June 4th, the British army is trapped at the coast near Dunkirk. The Germans have been driving toward Paris. The British go on the northern side, thinking that they're going to repel the attack in that way. In fact, the German columns sweep around and trap them right there on the shore of the English Channel. Churchill puts out the call for anyone in Britain who has a boat to go and bring soldiers back from Dunkirk. He manages to evacuate 338,000 soldiers who are on the beach there at Dunkirk and bring them back to England safely. Now, this is one of the key moments of the war. Hitler had an air force that was larger than the British Air Force. He had the British Army trapped on a small peninsula. He could have wiped them out. Why didn't he do it? He could really have ended the war against Britain right there, destroyed the British Army. Why didn't he do it? He might, yeah, I mean, I suppose he might have been afraid that that would bring the Americans into the war, though the Americans hadn't done anything yet, and it would be sort of surprising, in a way. I mean, Pearl Harbor happened because American territory was attacked. Dunkirk wouldn't have had the same impact on the American psyche.
It's a trap. It sounds like a trap. It's too good to be true type thing.
Well, it could be, yeah, it's like, oh, how can they be that foolish? There's got to be a trap. Yeah, no, it's a trap. I mean, it might be, but actually, it wasn't a trap. Who are the British? All right, let's go back. English. English is what kind of language? What language family are we part of? The Germanic languages, right? Who are the English people really? The Angles and the Saxons. Of course, also some Celtish blood, some Norman blood, but basically Angles and Saxons, i.e. Germans. Hitler thinks of everything through the eyes of race. And he looks at the British and he says, those people are Aryans. They are really Germans. They don't know it. Okay? But they are really Germans. They're speaking a Germanic language. They are ethnically German. They deserve to be part of Greater Germany. So do I want to smash them? Do I want to destroy them? No, the British are my natural allies. If I can only make them see reason. And really, he thought he was going to trap them in a position where they would have to ally. Now that Churchill was the leader, he realized, oh, that's an obstacle. But all I have to do is convince them that was a mistake. Get Churchill out of office and we can come to some accommodation and we'll have an alliance between London and Berlin. So he thinks, here, I'll show that I'm not a bad guy. I will show them they should get rid of that idiot Churchill and go back to negotiations and an alliance. I'll show them I won't attack them at Dunkirk. Noblesse oblige. I'll show them I can be a nice guy to you, you be a nice guy to me. It did not work. But that was his idea. Well, by June 10th, Norway surrendered. The Germans entered Paris on June 14th. So it took them about 5 weeks to defeat France and take Paris. And indeed, just a week later, France surrendered. So there is the British Army on the beach at Dunkirk, waiting for the evacuation. And by the way, think about that. 338,000 people evacuated by some naval ships, but mostly by just small pleasure boats, by people's sailing boats, by, fishing boats and things like that. It was an amazing achievement. July 10th, the Battle of Britain begins. The Germans begin to bomb British cities. They bomb airfields initially, factories in Britain, trying to shut down British industry and to ground the Royal Air Force. Their thought is, look, to destroy all the planes through aerial dogfights and so on, very difficult job. However, Hitler and his top generals think, and it's really a brilliant thought, if we destroy the airfields, they won't be able to land, they won't be able to take off. We can ground the Royal Air Force without destroying it, just by bombing the airfields. So, for several weeks, they do that. After about 2 weeks, Hitler decides it's not working. The Royal Air Force is still flying, he gives up on it. Actually, Churchill writes, we were within a few days of having to admit that the Royal Air Force had nowhere to take off and nowhere to land. If they had kept up that strategy for 1 more week, the British Air Force would have been grounded. We would have been sitting ducks. But Hitler gave up. And we'll see that pattern throughout the war. As brilliant as he is in calling everything correctly throughout the 1930s, he starts making mistake after mistake in the actual conduct of the war. And this is one of the first. He doesn't give the strategy time to work. He bombs British factories. But gosh, they're still producing airplanes? Okay, I guess that's not working. We'll bomb the airfields. After 2 weeks, they're still flying. I guess that's not working. When in fact it was working extremely well. And 1 more week of it would probably have succeeded. August 15th, they start the daylight bombing of cities. Up to this point, the bombing had been at night. But at this stage, they begin daylight bombing. And on August 23rd, for the first time, bombed London. The British, in retaliation, 2 days later, bombed Berlin. But they were not able to sustain the bombing campaign in the way that the Germans did. Here are scenes of London from the Battle of Britain. Here you can see barbed wire put around Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament, expecting an invasion. Here you see soldiers lined up to go off to war at the same time that families were sending their children out of the city. How many of you have ever read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? It starts this way, right? The kids are being sent out from London. Why? Because London is being bombed. And this was happening all over Britain. People were getting their children out of the cities, sending them off to the countryside to try to get them away from these targets of German air attacks. Here is the aerial defense. There were radar stations on the coast, but mostly in the cities it was people like this on rooftops with binoculars who were defending London. This shows you how vulnerable Britain was at this point. The Germans had taken Denmark, they had taken Norway, they had control, of course, of the bases in Germany, but then the Low Countries and also the coast of France. So all of those little airplanes are bases from which the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, could attack Britain. And all of those lines are lines of attack. So you can see the vulnerabilities were incredible. Here is London with smoke rising above it. Buildings on fire. The double-decker bus bombed out. Here are firefighters trying to put out the fire in the area of London heavily hit by the bombing. Here are people going to work the next morning after a nighttime bombing raid. Here are children sitting in front of their house, which has been destroyed. Here are kids in an air raid ditch as planes go overhead. You can see the different reactions, right? The sort of worry, well, I don't know what's going on with that kid. The faces of worry, a few of them looking almost smiling like, oh, this is cool. In any case, here you see the cathedral ringed in smoke. Now, what were Germany and Japan thinking? What was the strategy? There were really two strategic ideas. There was a northern strategy, which was directed primarily at Russia. And there was a southern strategy that was directed at the Middle East, the Far East, and India. Now, one of the puzzles of the war is that Germany chose to pursue the northern strategy by attacking Russia. Japan decided to pursue the southern strategy. And there's something very odd about that. Look at this map of the world. The northern strategy would have had both Germany and Japan attacking the Soviet Union from opposite sides. Now, Japan had gotten into a dispute with Russia in 1905, and it had been a bloody war that Japan had not come off that well in. There had been skirmishes since. Japan had tended to lose those. They feared an attack on Russia, though in this region of Siberia there really wasn't that much. If they had overcome initial defenses, they could have gone a long way. On the other hand, seizing what? A lot of Siberia that nobody particularly wanted. Germany did end up attacking in this direction, and of course faced problems we'll address soon. The southern strategy was for Japan to come into Southeast Asia and seize important trade routes as well as important oil fields and other minerals. The Germans could have attacked through the Middle East, most of which would have been friendly and simply allowed the Germans to pass through, wouldn't have fought, in order to take British India. The idea would have been to have this pincer movement to meet it up in India, carve up the British Empire for themselves, and then, by the way, have Russia surrounded. Now, there were problems with both strategies, but the fact that they chose different options, Japan going to the south and Germany going to the north, meant that their alliance didn't actually benefit either one of them. And one of the strangest aspects of this war is, why didn't they talk this out and try to formulate a combined strategy? They really never did. Now, there were some reasons. There were serious obstacles to both strategies. But on the other hand, they ended up pursuing things in a way that really made it almost two different wars. Now, there are two approaches to history, very, very broadly speaking. And in a way, this is a case study for one of them. The great man theory says, well, in slightly sexist fashion by the title, history is largely the record of decisions and actions of leaders, okay, of great men, or in our day, great men and women, who are actually in a position to make decisions that affect large numbers of people's lives. The historical determinist theory of history says, no, history is largely the play of social forces. It doesn't really matter who the leaders are, they're big forces that push the leaders in certain directions. Individual people have little or no free choice, they're really just the agents of these large forces. The Marxists tend toward this analysis. The 19th century opinion was pretty much the great man theory. If there's anything that makes a case for the great man theory, or something like it, it's this sort of action. What Hitler and Stalin ended up doing here, or for that matter, Mussolini or the Japanese leadership, None of these things seem inevitable. Was it inevitable that Japan take one strategy and Germany the other? I don't think so. What were the large social forces? If anything, these guys were leaders who were ignoring large-scale social forces and doing things on their own will that affected the lives of millions of people and ended the lives of millions, but without it being easy to say at all what these large forces really were. It looked like they were playing chess with humanity, as one historian has said. Neither man represented irresistible or even potent historical forces. We have the opposite of historical determinism, the apotheosis of the single autocrat, the single leader who is able single-handedly to affect large numbers of people's lives. Well, in any case, June 22nd, 1941, the Germans start Operation Barbarossa. They invade the USSR. This came as a complete shock to Stalin. In fact, Stalin, at this point, instituted yet another purge of his top officers. Why? Because he realized that he should have been fired as a result of not anticipating this and being tricked by the Germans, and was afraid of a military coup. Now, what was Hitler doing? Why did he attack Russia? He had two goals, and they turned out to be incompatible. One goal was simple: military conquest. He wanted to get to Moscow, take over the Russian government. But a second goal was social engineering. He sent a special unit of the SS, called the Einsatzgruppen, in order to go to Russia and wipe out undesirables. He thought that the Russian people, and in general Slavs, were lesser types. Okay? The Aryan race, the Germans, the British, they were the natural rulers. The Slavs were natural serfs. In fact, even the name, Slav, okay, means slave. So the thought was the Russians, the Poles, etc., don't really deserve to live. So he goes into Russia partly to seize territory, but partly to eliminate the Slav race. Now these goals turned out to be incompatible. Here I say the Russians hated Stalin. That's maybe too broad. But there was a huge amount of fear of Stalin, really throughout all of Russian society. And the areas of the USSR through which Hitler had to pass, Byelorussia, the Ukraine, those were the areas that had been starved in the 1930s. 30 to 40 million people perhaps killed by Stalin. So if Hitler had gone in and said, I am your great liberator, that Stalin who's been doing all these horrible things to you, fight him together with us, he would have found lots of people flocking to his side. But instead of enticing people to join him, he sent in the Einsatzgruppen. They shot 1 million Russians in 1941 alone. Now, half of them were Jews, eliminated because they were Jewish. The other half were simply Russians, eliminated because they were Slavs. The Russians realized they faced a war of extermination, and so began to fight to the death. Why? There was really no alternative. It became clear that Hitler's goal wasn't simply to conquer this territory, depose Stalin, himself administer it. No, his goal was racial extermination. Yeah?
I thought Hitler and Stalin had a pact.
They did have a pact, exactly, right? The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Hitler promised, we will never attack you. Now, he probably cheated. Hitler wasn't a very honorable guy. So that Hitler forms a pact with you and says, I promise a non-aggression treaty, that doesn't mean a whole lot. I've said you're in deep trouble if he says, I have no interest in you. You're in deeper trouble if he says, you know that treaty I had, I'm tearing it up. But in this case, he played his hand carefully. He didn't do anything to tip the Russians off that he was interested in them or Russian territory. He didn't do anything that said, I'm tearing up that tract. He just violated it. That's why Stalin was so deeply shocked. Stalin was somebody who might kill all sorts of internal opponents. But nevertheless, when he signed a treaty, he actually kind of meant it. I mean, he really would have come to the aid of Britain and France if they had signed that treaty before Molotov took over. And he really was prepared to help Hitler. In fact, he thought he had been doing that by coming in and dividing Poland with him and so on and so forth. And so Stalin was absolutely stunned at Hitler's immorality. Now, I want you to think about that for a moment. Joseph Stalin, how do you stun him through your own immorality? What do you have to do, right? What kind of person do you have to be to shock Joseph Stalin? But he was shocked. And so, indeed, Stalin recognizes pretty quickly not only the betrayal, but that this is actually a race war meant to wipe out the Russians. Well, not only the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Byelorussians, everybody else really who had Slavic blood. And so his response is a scorched earth policy. Destroy everything. Don't leave anything that could help the German army. Well, we're out of time, so next time we will continue this, but our main attention will go to the war in the Pacific, and we'll look at the US entry into the war and the Japanese phase of it.